He thought she was just another guest walking in from the rain, but before the night was over, an old wooden box would remind him who he used to be. The October wind swept through downtown Chicago, carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves across the sidewalk in front of the Grand Regent Hotel. Beneath the golden lights of the entrance stood Naomi Carter, holding a small weathered wooden box against her chest. The box was old enough to have belonged to another generation. A faded blue ribbon wrapped around it, and one corner of the lid had been worn smooth by time. Naomi looked through the glass doors of the hotel and immediately wished she had worn something else. Women in glittering gowns crossed the marble lobby, while men in expensive suits laughed beside enormous arrangements of white roses. The charity gala looked less like an event and more like another world entirely. She glanced down at her modest dark green dress and sensible black shoes. She did not belong here. 3 days earlier, she had buried her grandmother, Margaret Carter. The grief still sat heavily inside her chest. After the funeral, she had been sorting through old belongings when she found the wooden box hidden inside a cedar chest at the foot of Margaret's bed. Attached to it had been a handwritten note. "Take this to Ethan Kong. Do not open it." That was all. No explanation. No address. No reason. Naomi had searched the name online and discovered that Ethan Kong was one of the city's most influential businessmen and the host of tonight's gala. The discovery made no sense. Her grandmother had spent most of her life working in a public school cafeteria and living quietly in a small brick house on the south side of Chicago. Yet Margaret Carter never asked for anything without a reason. If she wanted the box delivered, then Naomi would deliver it. A doorman smiled politely and held the door open. Warm air spilled onto the sidewalk. "Good evening, ma'am." Naomi thanked him and stepped inside. The lobby smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a piano played softly. She followed the sound until she reached the ballroom entrance and stopped. Crystal. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. Hundreds of candles glowed across white tablecloths. Waiters moved through the room, carrying silver trays and sparkling glasses. Naomi suddenly felt invisible. She tightened her grip on the box and almost turned around. Then she remembered her grandmother's voice. "Finish what you start, sweetheart." Taking a slow breath, she stepped into the ballroom. Guests walked around her without noticing. A few glanced at her and quickly looked away. Near the center of the room stood a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit. He was speaking with several donors, his posture calm and effortless. A subtle tattoo disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. Even from a distance, there was something about him that made people naturally move aside. Naomi recognized him immediately. Ethan Kong, the man she had come to find. She looked down at the old wooden box one more time and wondered what secret it carried. Then she looked back at him. At that exact moment, he raised his eyes and saw her standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the ballroom. Then someone called Ethan's name, and the connection disappeared. Naomi exhaled softly. She was relieved. The last thing she wanted was to interrupt an important man in the middle of his own event. She stepped aside and moved toward a large arrangement of white roses near one of the windows. Rain slid down the glass outside, turning the city lights into streaks of gold and silver. She held the wooden box close to her chest and tried to gather her courage. A few guests passed by and gave her polite smiles, but nobody stopped to speak with her. She looked around the room and felt like a visitor in someone else's dream. Then a warm voice broke the silence. "I do not believe we have met." Naomi turned and saw a woman in an elegant ivory gown standing beside her. Diamond earrings sparkled beneath the chandelier light. The woman smiled kindly and extended her hand. "I am Victoria Sinclair." Naomi shook her hand gently. "Naomi Carter. It is nice to meet you, Naomi. Which organization are you representing tonight?" Naomi smiled awkwardly. "Actually, I am not representing anyone. I came here to see Mr. Kong." Victoria looked surprised. "You know Ethan?" "Not exactly." Naomi glanced at the box in her hands. "I have something that belongs to him." Victoria's curiosity immediately grew. "Well, that sounds mysterious." She looked more closely at Naomi and then at the old wooden box. I hope I am not being rude, but I do not think I've seen you at any of these events before. Naomi laughed softly. That is because I have never been to one. First gala. Victoria smiled. Then welcome to the most expensive room in Chicago tonight. Naomi laughed again, and some of the tension left her shoulders. For a moment, they simply stood together watching people move around the ballroom. Then Victoria's eyes settled on Naomi's natural curls. Your hair is beautiful, she said. Thank you. I have always admired hair like yours. It has so much texture in life. Naomi smiled politely. She had heard similar comments many times before. Victoria stepped a little closer, her expression full of curiosity rather than malice. I have always wondered what it feels like. Before Naomi could answer, Victoria gently reached out and touched one of her curls. The moment lasted less than a second. It felt much longer. A nearby conversation stopped. Someone lowered a glass. Another guest looked away uncomfortably. Naomi remained perfectly still. She did not step back. She simply looked at Victoria and said softly, "Most people ask first." The words were quiet, but they carried enough weight to make the room around them seem suddenly smaller. Victoria immediately withdrew her hand. Her face turned red with embarrassment. Oh goodness, I'm so sorry. I truly did not mean to offend you. Naomi's expression remained calm. I know, there was no anger in her voice. No accusation, only dignity. The silence around them deepened. At the center of the ballroom, Ethan Kong had just lifted a glass of sparkling water. Then he noticed the unusual stillness. His eyes moved across the room and settled on the two women standing near the white roses. He saw the look on Victoria's face. He saw the old wooden box in Naomi's hands. And then he saw the expression in Naomi's eyes. Without saying a word, he slowly placed his glass on the table beside him and began walking toward her. The conversations around them faded as Ethan crossed the ballroom. People stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. There was something about him that naturally created space wherever he went. Naomi watched him approach, suddenly aware of the wooden box in her hands and the strange path that had brought her there. Ethan stopped beside the two women and looked first at Victoria, then at Naomi. His voice was calm when he spoke. Is everything all right? Victoria looked embarrassed. I believe I made a mistake. He waited patiently. I touched her hair without asking. For a brief moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded once, as though he understood something deeper than the words themselves. He turned toward Naomi. Are you all right? The question was simple, but there was genuine concern in it. Naomi gave him a small smile. I am fine. He studied her face for a second longer and seemed relieved by the answer. Then he looked at Victoria. Curiosity is natural, he said gently. Respect simply asks us to pause first. Victoria lowered her eyes. You are right. I am very sorry. Then I think there is nothing more to say. The tension in the air softened immediately. No one had been scolded. No one had been humiliated. Yet somehow dignity had been restored. Ethan's attention then shifted to the wooden box Naomi held against her chest. He looked at it with quiet curiosity. I do not believe we have met. He extended his hand. I am Ethan Kong. Naomi shook his hand carefully. Naomi Carter. And you came here tonight to see me? She nodded. I did. May I ask why? Naomi looked down at the box. I have something that belongs to you. A faint look of surprise crossed his face. To me? She nodded again. It belonged to my grandmother. Ethan glanced at the old wood and faded ribbon. Did I know your grandmother? Naomi hesitated. For some reason, speaking the name suddenly felt important. I think you did. He waited. Her name was Margaret Carter. The effect was immediate. Ethan's expression changed so quickly that Naomi almost thought she had imagined it. He blinked once, then again. The sounds of the ballroom seemed to disappear around him. What did you say? He asked softly. Margaret Carter, Naomi repeated. She passed away 3 days ago. Ethan did not move. The name seemed to reach somewhere deep inside him, somewhere untouched by time. He looked at Naomi, then at the wooden box. Finally he whispered, almost to himself, Margaret. There was recognition in his eyes now. And something else. Something very close to sorrow. Naomi felt her heart begin to race. You knew her? He looked at her again, but it took him a moment to answer. I have not heard that name in over 30 years. The room around them seemed suddenly too bright and too loud. Ethan slowly drew a breath. Would you come with me? Naomi blinked. Of course. He nodded toward a hallway beside the ballroom. There is a private sitting room nearby. Then he looked at the box again. I think there may be something in there that I've been waiting a lifetime to see. Without another word, he stepped aside and motioned for her to follow him. Naomi tightened her grip on the old wooden box and walked beside him, carrying a secret that neither of them fully understood. The private sitting room was quiet, almost untouched by the music and conversation outside. A small fire glowed inside a stone fireplace, and rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the city. Ethan closed the door behind them and motioned toward two armchairs beside a low wooden table. Naomi sat carefully, still holding the box. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Ethan seemed unable to take his eyes off the faded blue ribbon tied around the lid. Finally, he sat across from her and folded his hands together. I have not heard that name in a very long time, he said softly. Margaret Carter. Naomi watched him carefully. You really did know my grandmother. A faint smile appeared on his face. I knew a woman named Margaret Carter who changed my family's life. The room grew quiet again. Ethan looked at the old box. May I? Naomi nodded and placed it gently on the table between them. She wanted you to have it. Ethan touched the ribbon as though he recognized it. Slowly, he untied the bow and lifted the lid. Inside were only three things: a brass key, a faded photograph, and a folded letter. The moment he saw the photograph, he stopped breathing for a second. He picked it up with careful hands. Naomi leaned forward. The picture showed an older black woman standing beside a Korean couple and a young boy wearing an oversized winter coat. They were standing on the front steps of a small brick house. The boy was smiling and holding a brass key in one hand. Ethan stared at the picture, his eyes suddenly filled with disbelief. No, he whispered. Then a soft laugh escaped him. I cannot believe this. He looked at Naomi. Do you know who this little boy is? She shook her head. Ethan touched the photograph with his finger. That boy is me. Naomi covered her mouth in surprise and leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she could only stare at him. The elegant man sitting across from her and the smiling child in the photograph suddenly became the same person. Ethan carefully placed the photograph on the table and picked up the brass key. This key opened the spare bedroom in your grandmother's house. Naomi blinked. My grandmother let your family stay with her. He nodded slowly. 30 years ago, my parents and I had nowhere to go. We had lost our apartment during the winter. His voice softened. We spent several nights sleeping inside our car. He looked at the key again. Then your grandmother found us. Naomi felt tears begin to gather in her eyes. She never told me this story. Ethan smiled gently. That sounds exactly like her. He unfolded the letter with careful fingers and began reading silently. As he read, the sadness in his face slowly turned into warmth. Finally, he smiled. She has not changed at all. He handed the letter to Naomi. Near the bottom was a single handwritten sentence. If this box ever reaches Ethan, remind him that he still owes me a game of checkers. Naomi laughed softly through her tears. Ethan laughed too, and suddenly he looked years younger. Then he turned the paper over and found one more line written on the back. Kindness only matters if it keeps moving. The smile slowly faded from his face. He read the sentence again and looked toward the rain outside the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I think your grandmother sent this box because she knew I still had a promise to keep. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, and the rain continued to whisper against the windows. Ethan held the letter in his hands, as though it were something fragile. Then he smiled sadly. She always knew how to say exactly what needed to be said. Naomi looked at him. What promise do you think she meant? Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at the photograph again. When my family finally got back on our feet, my parents wanted to repay her. A small laugh escaped him. She refused every dollar. He shook his head. She said that kindness was not a loan. It was a responsibility. Naomi smiled because those words sounded exactly like her grandmother. Ethan continued. The day we moved out of her house, she handed me this key and told me something I never forgot. He picked up the brass key and turned it slowly between his fingers. She said that someday I would be in a position to open doors for other people. And when that day came, I had better not forget how it felt to stand outside in the cold. The room became quiet again. Naomi felt tears gather in her eyes. She never told me any of this. Ethan looked at her warmly. I think she wanted her kindness to remain simple. She never did good things so people would talk about them. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the photograph. But she changed everything for us. He stood and walked toward the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain. I remember the first dinner we had in her house. She made soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. He laughed softly. I thought it was the best meal I had ever eaten. Naomi smiled through her tears. She made grilled cheese whenever someone was sad. Ethan turned around, surprised. She did. Naomi nodded. Every single time. They both laughed quietly. For a moment, it felt as though Margaret Carter was sitting in the room with them. Then Ethan's expression grew thoughtful again. Everything I have today began in that little house. He looked at the photograph. Every business, every opportunity, every person I have been able to help. He swallowed softly. All of it traces back to one woman who opened her front door to 3 strangers. Naomi looked down at the wooden box in her lap. She had spent her entire life believing her grandmother had lived an ordinary life. Suddenly, it seemed impossible to measure the number of lives she had touched. Ethan walked back to the table and carefully closed the lid of the box. There are more than 300 people in the ballroom tonight, he said quietly. Most of them think they came to a charity event. He looked directly at Naomi. I think they came to hear about your grandmother. Naomi blinked. You want to tell them this story? He nodded. I think people need to remember that one act of kindness can echo for decades. She looked uncertain. I do not know if I belong on a stage in front of all those people. Ethan smiled gently. Miss Carter, tonight you belong there more than anyone else. He picked up the wooden box and held it carefully. Your grandmother opened her door for my family when we had nowhere to go. He looked at the brass key resting inside. Now I think it is my turn to open a door for her memory. Then he held the box out to Naomi and offered her his hand. Will you come with me? Naomi looked at his hand for a moment and then placed hers in it. Together they walked back toward the ballroom, carrying the old wooden box between them. As soon as the doors opened, conversation softened. People noticed immediately that something had changed. Ethan's expression was different. The woman who had arrived alone now stood beside him. They crossed the ballroom slowly until they reached the small stage where earlier speeches had been given. A microphone waited beside a table covered in white flowers and candles. Ethan turned toward Naomi. Will you stand with me? She nodded, though her heart had begun to race. He stepped onto the stage and picked up the microphone. Little by little, the room grew quiet. Glasses were lowered. Conversations ended. More than 300 guests turned their attention toward him. Ethan looked around the ballroom and smiled gently. I know this evening was meant to celebrate generosity, he began, but something unexpected happened tonight. Curious expressions appeared throughout the room. He looked at Naomi and then at the wooden box in her hands. A few minutes ago, a woman walked into this ballroom carrying a piece of my childhood. The room became even quieter. Most of you know me as a businessman. Some of you know me as the chairman of this foundation. Very few of you know where my story truly began. He paused. 30 years ago, my family lost our home. A murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan's voice remained calm. We spent several nights sleeping in our car during one of the coldest winters I can remember. He glanced toward the old box again. Then a woman named Margaret Carter opened her front door and invited us inside. Complete silence filled the room. Ethan held up the brass key. This key belonged to the spare bedroom where my parents and I lived for nearly 6 months. Several guests looked stunned. Others exchanged glances. Ethan smiled softly. Everything I have today began because one woman decided that someone else's hardship mattered. He looked toward Naomi. Tonight her granddaughter brought this key back to me. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Naomi suddenly felt tears gathering in her eyes. She had come to deliver a box. She never imagined she would be standing before hundreds of people hearing her grandmother's name spoken with gratitude. Ethan continued, I think we spend too much time celebrating success and not enough time honoring the people who made success possible. He lowered the key and looked around the room. The woman who changed my life never asked for recognition. She simply saw 3 strangers and made room for them at her table. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Then Ethan smiled and extended his hand toward Naomi. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet the granddaughter of the woman who gave my family a future. For a brief second, nobody moved. Then, someone began clapping. Another guest joined in. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom was filled with applause. Several people stood. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Naomi stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, holding the wooden box against her chest. She had entered the hotel believing she did not belong there. Now an entire room was standing because of the quiet kindness of her grandmother. And in that moment, she finally understood that some acts of love never truly disappear. They simply wait for the right night to be remembered. The applause seemed to go on forever. Naomi stood beneath the crystal chandeliers with tears in her eyes, holding the wooden box against her chest as though it contained her grandmother's heartbeat. Slowly, the applause faded, but the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. People no longer looked at her as a stranger. They looked at her with warmth, curiosity, and respect. Ethan stepped away from the microphone and remained beside her. Then something unexpected happened. A man near the front of the room raised his hand. I never met Margaret Carter, he said softly, but my mother did something similar for a family when I was a child. I have not thought about that in years. Another guest smiled through tears. My grandmother kept extra chairs at her table because she believed someone might need dinner. A woman near the back of the ballroom nodded. My father used to say that kindness should cost us something or is not really kindness. One by one, people began sharing small memories. Stories filled the room like candlelight. Stories about neighbors, teachers, church volunteers, and strangers who had opened doors at exactly the right moment. The charity gala no longer felt like a formal event. It felt like a room full of people remembering what mattered most. Then Naomi noticed movement nearby. Victoria Sinclair was slowly making her way toward the stage. The elegant woman looked nervous. When she reached the front, she looked up at Naomi. May I say something? Ethan nodded and handed her the microphone. Victoria took a slow breath. Tonight, I came here planning to donate money and enjoy an evening with friends. She looked directly at Naomi. Instead, I learned something about myself. The ballroom became completely silent. Victoria's voice trembled slightly. Earlier this evening, I touched this woman's hair without asking. I did not mean to be disrespectful, but intention does not erase impact. Naomi looked at her quietly. I forgot something important. Victoria swallowed softly. Every person deserves to have their dignity protected, even in small moments. She lowered her eyes. I'm truly sorry. The room remained silent. Then Naomi stepped forward and smiled gently. Thank you. Nothing more. No lecture. No anger. Just 2 simple words. Yet they seemed to fill the entire ballroom. Victoria smiled with relief and wiped a tear from her cheek. Several guests began clapping again, this time more softly. Ethan watched the 2 women for a long moment. Then he looked toward the crowd. I think tonight has already become more meaningful than anything we planned. A few people laughed softly. He smiled, and I believe that is exactly how Margaret Carter would have wanted it. More laughter followed. Naomi looked around the room and suddenly realized something extraordinary. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like the woman standing alone near the entrance wondering whether she belonged. Somehow her grandmother's kindness had reached across 30 years and built a bridge between strangers. Ethan leaned toward her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Your grandmother just changed this room. Naomi looked at him and smiled through her tears. I think she spent her whole life doing that. And for the first time that evening, Ethan laughed without sadness. The sound was warm and genuine, and under the glow of the chandeliers, the room seemed brighter than before. The soft applause gradually faded, but the warmth in the ballroom remained. People who had arrived expecting another elegant charity dinner were now standing with tears in their eyes, holding memories they had not thought about in years. Naomi looked around the room and saw smiles everywhere she turned. Some guests nodded to her with respect. Others simply placed a hand over their hearts. The old wooden box felt lighter in her hand somehow, as if the stories inside it had finally found their way home. Ethan stepped back toward the microphone and waited until the room became quiet once more. He looked at the brass key resting inside the box and smiled. "There's one more thing I need to do tonight." Curious expressions appeared across the ballroom. He looked toward Naomi. 30 years ago, Margaret Carter opened a door for my family. I have spent my entire adult life trying to honor what she taught me. He paused for a moment. But tonight, I realized I have not done enough. The room became perfectly still. Ethan reached into his pocket and unfolded a small note card. "Tomorrow morning, I will meet with the board of my foundation." He looked up and smiled gently. "And I will ask them to establish the Margaret Carter Scholarship and Housing Fund." For a second, there was complete silence. Then a collective gasp filled the room. Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. "No," she whispered softly. "You do not have to do that." Ethan looked at her kindly. "Actually, I do." He turned back toward the crowd. "This fund will help families facing temporary hardship and provide scholarships for young people who need someone to believe in them." He glanced at the photograph of the little boy standing beside Margaret Carter. "Because one person believed in my family when we had nothing." Applause erupted once again, louder than before. Several guests rose to their feet. Others joined them until nearly everyone in the ballroom was standing. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. She had spent the last week mourning her grandmother in a quiet little house on the south side of the city. She never imagined that same grandmother would be honored beneath crystal chandeliers by some of the most influential people in Chicago. Ethan picked up the brass key and held it in his hand. Then he turned toward Naomi. "I think this belongs with you now." He placed the old key in her palm and gently closed her fingers around it. "Your grandmother trusted you to bring this box here." His voice softened. "I think she also trusted you to carry her story forward." Naomi looked down at the key. The metal felt warm from his hand. "I do not know if I can do that," she admitted quietly. Ethan smiled. "I think you already are." The applause slowly faded, and the room settled into a peaceful silence. Beyond the tall windows, the rain had finally stopped. The city lights reflected across the glass like hundreds of tiny stars. Naomi looked at the people around her and realized that none of them would ever forget this evening. Neither would she. Her grandmother had once opened the door of a small brick house to 3 strangers. Decades later, that simple act of kindness had opened another door entirely. And standing beneath the glow of the chandeliers, Naomi understood something she had never understood before. Some legacies are not built from wealth or fame. They are built from ordinary moments of compassion that continue to echo long after the people who created them are gone. The evening slowly began to wind down, but very few people seemed ready to leave. Guests remained near their tables, speaking in softer voices than before. Some approached Naomi to shake her hand. Others thanked her for sharing her grandmother's story, even though she had said so little. The ballroom no longer felt like a room full of strangers. It felt like a gathering of people who had remembered something important together. Ethan stood beside her near the stage, looking out across the candlelit room. "I do not think anyone will forget tonight," he said quietly. Naomi smiled and looked down at the brass key resting in her hand. "Neither will I." The old key felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of everything it carried. Ethan glanced at the wooden box. "Your grandmother had a remarkable way of changing lives without asking for anything in return." Naomi laughed softly. "She would probably be embarrassed by all of this." He smiled. "You are probably right." For a moment, they simply stood there, listening to the soft piano music drifting through the ballroom. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a small card. He handed it to her. "This has my personal number on it." Naomi looked surprised. "I do not think people like you usually hand these out." A warm smile appeared on his face. People like me usually do not get handed pieces of their childhood either. She laughed, and so did he. The sound felt easy and natural. If you ever need anything, he said, or if you simply want to tell me another story about your grandmother, I hope you will call. Naomi looked at the card and slipped it carefully into the wooden box beside the photograph and the letter. I think she would like that. A few minutes later, they walked together toward the hotel entrance. The marble lobby was nearly empty now. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The sidewalks glistened beneath the streetlights, and the city seemed unusually peaceful. They stopped beside the revolving doors. Naomi looked back toward the ballroom one last time. Earlier that evening, she had stood in the same place, wondering whether she belonged inside. Now, she felt as though she were leaving with something far more valuable than she had brought. She had arrived carrying a mystery and was leaving with a legacy. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. I spent years wondering if I would ever have the chance to thank your grandmother. He smiled gently. I think tonight was the closest thing to an answer I could have hoped for. Naomi's eyes filled with tears once more. I think she sent me here because she knew you still remembered. He nodded slowly. Some people leave behind money. Some leave behind buildings. Your grandmother left behind open doors. The words hung softly between them. Naomi looked down at the brass key in her hand. Then she slipped it back inside the box and closed the lid. I think I finally understand why she wanted me to bring this to you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Why is that? She smiled. Because kindness only matters if it keeps moving. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then he smiled too. Outside, the clouds finally parted, revealing a few stars above the city. Naomi stepped through the doors and into the cool night air. She turned once more and saw Ethan standing beneath the golden lights of the hotel entrance, watching her leave with a grateful expression. Then she looked up at the sky and imagined her grandmother smiling somewhere beyond the rain. And as she walked toward the quiet street with the old wooden box in her hands, she realized something beautiful. A single act of compassion had traveled across 30 years, crossed the lives of strangers, and finally found its way home.